So greetings, everyone, and thank you for coming. Maybe Rachel, you could admit people while I'm talking. My name is Alice Rothschild, and I'm on the steering committee of the Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council. And I want to welcome everyone to our Health Advisory Council webinar. And the title of this webinar is The Crisis of UNRWA in Gaza, a report from Sam Rose. And just so people know, we are part of Jewish Voice for Peace, and we've been doing regular webinars for years. We're currently doing them every 8 weeks and focusing on health and human rights issues, primarily in Gaza. And the format of today's webinar will be a presentation for 20 to 30 minutes, and then a Q&A using the chat function. So I will be monitoring the chat. If you have questions, put it in the chat, and then I will look at the questions, and Rachel will also look at questions, and we'll come up with questions for Sam. So Rachel Rubin is my co-host here. Please stay muted at all times and keep your questions on topic, respectful, and short. And if you have been fortunate enough not to have lived on Zoom the last couple of years and don't know how to use the chat function, you hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen. I think it's the bottom on my computer. And the chat function comes up. You click on it, and be sure it says to everyone, and you type in your question. And as I've said, the webinar is being recorded, so if you don't want your face or your name, please shut off your camera and change your name on the picture. So I'm going to start out with an introduction. I'm very, very excited that we're going to be hearing from Sam Rose, who is the acting director of UNRWA Affairs in Gaza, a role that he took up in December of 2024. He has worked for UNRWA in Gaza since January of 2024, and prior to that served as UNRWA's Director of Planning, with responsibility for the agency's operational and strategic planning across 5 fields of operation. He's worked in the field of international development and humanitarian affairs for more than 2 decades, including roles at UNRWA, the UK Department of International Development, DFID, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, primarily in the Middle East, including Egypt, Gaza, West Bank, Jordan, Yemen, as well as in South Asia. So he's a man with a huge amount of experience. Now, while at the DFID, he led the UK government's humanitarian response to the 2015 earthquakes in Nepal and coordinated protection work in Sierra Leone during the Ebola epidemic. So I want to welcome you, Sam, and we are very happy to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Alice, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm speaking to you not from Gaza, but from Brussels, where I'm just here for a few days of meetings. Very, very happy to be here, Alice. When we first discussed this I think it was back in February, I wasn't quite sure where I would be at the time we organized this. I mean, I'd hoped that I'd be speaking to you from the Gaza Strip, but I'm not able to be there because of the Knesset legislation that was passed against UNRWA in October of last year, and which came into effect at the end of January. I'll come back to that in a bit in terms of what it means for UNRWA's operations and services inside of Gaza. I mean, it means that I physically can't be there, and our other international staff can't be there. But the ramifications are a bit wider than that, and it's something I'll come back to. I'll also talk a bit about what UNRWA is doing, both in terms of its delivery and how we're responding to the current situation, and how the current siege and blockade and military escalation impacts our operations. And I'll say a bit about what we're calling on member states to support us with in terms of our advocacy. But of course, I mean, it always has to start with an update and with the latest on the current situation in the Gaza Strip. And as we know, as we've seen over the past 19 or so months, the situation has been very fluid. But I think you'll have all seen the marked deterioration that has begun over the past 3 or 4 days that was telegraphed in many ways. In early May, Israel indicated that it would go ahead with a major escalation following President Trump's visit. That visit, of course, has now come to an end. In the meantime, Hamas did release an additional hostage, an Israeli-American hostage, but it doesn't appear to have put an end to the Israeli plans. And as we speak now, if you're waking up, if you're on the west coast of the States, you'll be reading that that a lot of this, in terms of ground operations, troop movements, intensification of bombardments, mass loss of life, is actually starting now. So, of course, a deeply, deeply worrying situation. Staff, colleagues on the ground, and others in the humanitarian community describe it as bad, or as the worst it's been since the 7th of October 2023. And I think that's a function both of what's happening physically, in terms of the intensity of the bombardments and the stated intention of the Israeli authorities, but also just a function of the fact that, I mean, we're into month 19 or so of this now. So with every passing day, people's ability to cope and manage the situation is further undermined, particularly in a situation where supplies have not been allowed in for so long. So mentally, physically, etc., the people of Gaza are really struggling to deal with what's kind of completely unprecedented, completely unacceptable on one level, but somehow acceptable for them to endure on another level. Now, I've got a few slides that I thought would be happy to run through. I won't talk to them word by word, but it may just help to kind of structure some of what I'm going to say. So I hope you can see those slides. And I'll just change okay. So this is, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you know this context, but I mean, the period since the 2nd of March has been difficult and gradually more difficult. It was the 2nd of March when the blockade came in, and since that date, it's now over 11 weeks, like 77, 78 days. Nothing at all has come into Gaza in terms of humanitarian aid and commercial supplies. There were some reports today that some medicines were able to enter from Jordan, but if so, that would be the first time any supplies have come in since the 2nd of March. But otherwise, there's been a complete halt on entry of goods, commercial supplies, aid, but also fuel and gas, which is essential not just for people to cook their food, but also to power the water pumps, the wells, the desalination plants, etc. So a real squeeze on the population. Of course, 2 or 3 weeks after that, on the 18th of March, the ceasefire broke down very violently and very, very brutally. And whilst in the first week of that ceasefire breakdown, we did see very intense activities, they kind of scaled down a bit until the last week or so. And as you'll see reported on the news, we're now seeing dramatic escalations. Reports of over 100 people killed per day over the past 4 or 5 days, which, as I said, would put this at the most intense that we've seen military operations since the start of the war, and also the worst conditions in relation to restriction on entry of goods and supplies. And whereas in the first weeks of this blockade, distributions were able to continue because of the volumes of goods that we brought in during the ceasefire, aid distributions themselves essentially ground to a halt about 4 weeks ago. UNRWA and WFP were providing universal food and universal food, in the form of food parcels, but also flour to the entire population. That stopped about a month ago. There are community kitchens that run across the Gaza Strip. They're still functioning to some degree, but the number of meals that they're able to provide is diminishing rapidly. This time last week, they were providing about 1 million meals a day, which is impressive in scale. But when you've got, of course, over 2 million people, the food need is 6 million or so meals a day. Those kitchens are now down to about 300,000 meals a day. And when I say meals, it's essentially a bowl of rice with maybe a bit of tomato sauce or tomato ketchup or stock cube. It's a really, really kind of paltry meal with very little nutritional value. And that's why, of course, we're seeing increases in food insecurity, increases in malnutrition. The IPC, a committee that works internationally in aid environments to assess food security conditions, issued I think its third or fourth report about a week ago, and they found that 500,000 people, close to more than 1 in 5 of the population, are now facing starvation. And similarly, we're seeing increases in rates of malnutrition against young children. And this situation, of course, is just going to get worse by the day and will continue to get worse until the supplies come in. Once those supplies come in, if they're able to come in a sustained way, if people are able to access those supplies, if clean water is available, then it will be possible to get on top of the situation quite easily. Gaza is relatively speaking an incredibly easy place in which to distribute aid. The problem is if that aid can't come in, and right now it can't come in because there are 1 or 2 choke points that Israel is controlling, and Israel is blocking, and Israel is closing. And it's been quite clear in its intentions to do this as a pressure point on Hamas, which runs contrary to international humanitarian law. The idea that food should be used as a weapon of war is illegal in all conflicts. Parties to the conflicts have a responsibility and a legal obligation to facilitate supply of aid and key services to civilians inside Gaza, and clearly that is no longer happening in Gaza with the blockade and UNRWA and others. We have enough food, enough supplies outside of Gaza to feed the population for many months. They're stuck on the border, in some cases literally kilometers away, in Ashdod, in Israel, south of Tel Aviv, in El Arish, 40 or 50 kilometers to the west of the southern Gaza Strip, or in Jordan, so 2 or 3 hours drive away. So thousands and thousands of trucks that, as I say, could meet the food needs and the other basic needs in terms of shelter, in terms of healthcare for the 2 million people of Gaza for several months. In the build-up to the operation, the Gideon's Chariot operation that now seems to be underway, Israel had been gradually reducing the space in which people were permitted to exist inside of Gaza, either through declaring or establishing buffer zones around the border, or declaring evacuation orders and ordering people out of certain urban areas with essentially with threat of death if they were to remain. And what that means is we're left with about 30% of Gaza is outside of these areas. You'll see in a map shortly where these areas are. They're partly the Mawasi areas that we're all familiar with from earlier in the conflict, and other urban areas to the west of the Salahuddin Road, which is the main artery that runs north to south in the Gaza Strip. And another, I mean, this is a conflict that has surpassed all superlatives in terms of the fastest urban destruction of any, or the fastest destruction of any urban environment in living memory, the fastest descent into acute food insecurity in any conflict in living memory, and also the greatest number of journalists killed in any conflict. These are Palestinian journalists, because the Israeli authorities does not permit the international press into Gaza. There've been massive numbers of medical personnel killed, I think over 1,200, according to the Norwegian Refugee Council or another charity, and 300 people working for UNRWA, which makes this the highest number of UN casualties in any conflict that the UN has faced. So absolutely catastrophic for UNRWA as an organization and for the UN as an organization. In total, I think about 400 or 500, 400 aid workers have lost their lives in Gaza. The vast majority are UNRWA, given the scale of UNRWA's operations. We have about 350 what we call installations inside the Gaza Strip. These are mainly schools. We had 200 school buildings. There are also health clinics. We had 22 health clinics, distribution centers, sanitation offices, office buildings, etc. So about 350 installations that we operated on the eve of the conflict in Gaza, and over 300 have now been impacted in the conflict. Some such as this, and this is a photo of an UNRWA school in Barej that was hit about 10 days or so ago. I think 33 people confirmed killed in this attack, and these were mainly women and children, the people who've been seeking shelter either in the classrooms that you can see or in tents in the courtyard of the school. And so many of our installations have been hit directly in incidents such as this. Others have been hit indirectly, either in crossfire between Hamas and Israel, or else they're in such close proximity to the targets of Israeli attacks that they've been hit by shrapnel, damaged in collateral, etc. And this is one reason why we're seeing such high numbers of casualties in the war, that given how overcrowded and how densely populated the livable parts of Gaza are, it's absolutely inevitable, given the munitions that are being used, that there'll be large numbers of civilian casualties. We've been warning against this since the start of the war. We've been calling for law to be adhered to in terms of proportionality, in terms of precaution, in terms of distinction between civilian and military targets. But it's inevitable in a built-up environment such as Gaza that you're going to see large numbers of civilian casualties, and they're continuing them, as I say, now at rates much higher than we've seen earlier in the conflict. This you can see on the right-hand side is the map that I referred to. So around the borders of Gaza, the north, east, and south, you can see a combination of the orange parts of the buffer zones that have been set up as no-go areas, and the blue and the brown are a combination of buffer zones and displacement orders. And what happens with the displacement orders, as you may have seen, people just get text messages or leaflets are dropped from the sky instructing them to leave certain areas in advance of intense military operations. Sometimes those military operations are more kind of strategic in objective, that Israel purposely wants to, clear or flatten or control a certain area. Oftentimes they are issued the evacuation orders, displacement orders, in response to rocket fire from particular areas. Now, typically when the evacuation orders are issued, they're never rescinded. People do start to go back at some point in time to some of them, if it's clear that the military operation has diminished and drawn to a halt. But sometimes these evacuation orders will remain active and in place for long periods of time. And look, since the evacuation orders that have been issued since the ceasefire broke down, about 500,000 people have been displaced, or almost 500,000 people. So again, 1 in 5 of the population. And we're now looking at, close to 2 million people inside of Gaza who have been displaced since the start of the war. So essentially the entire population, except for those living in western parts of middle Gaza, that has remained relatively untouched. And many people have been displaced on multiple occasions. We have many staff who talk about being displaced 5 times, 10 times, etc. What we saw during the ceasefire is that many people did move back to their homes, either in the east of Khan Yunis or back to Gaza City. And with the onset of hostilities again, many have fled again. Certainly, people who moved back to Rafah have fled again, given how intense the military operations are. Interestingly, of the million or so people who moved north following the ceasefire, slightly less than a million, sorry, about 750,000 people who moved north. Most of them remain in the north. Now, there has been lots of movement west from eastern parts of Gaza City and Jabalia camp to parts of western Gaza, but there's been very little movement across the checkpoint, the Netzarim corridor checkpoint, which on the map here is just north of where it says Zahra, where you can see the checkpoints on marked on the screen. Very few people have taken the decision to return south. So one of Israel's stated objectives of the military operation right now is to empty northern Gaza, but as of now, we are seeing relatively limited movement. I mean, of course, that could change very, very quickly in the event of massive bombardments that leave people no choice. And what these repeated evacuation orders mean for our operations is that we're constantly having to adjust our footprint, both in response to where people are moving to, but also in response to lack of safety of installations if they find themselves inside any evacuation zones. And as you can see on the screen, large number of our premises do. And when those evacuation orders are issued, there's always a massive effort to try and secure supplies. If it's a health center, to secure supplies, equipment, medicine, solar panels, and things like that, either to transport those supplies to another location where we are providing services, or just to store them, just to protect them in the event that the premises once again become accessible. As I mentioned earlier, we're providing services in fixed locations, but also in many of our shelters. We have about 115 shelters that are currently active, operational across the Gaza Strip, with over 100,000 people inside those school buildings and many hundreds of thousands of more sheltering in the vicinity of them. People gather in the areas in and around UNRWA buildings, I think partly because of the services that are available there, and I'll come back to that in later on, but also because of the sense that being under the UN flag will offer increased protection. I mean, the reality is, as you can see from the final bullet here, that there's not much protection that's guaranteed in these installations. 767 people killed since the start of the war, and close to 2,500 injured. So that's more than one person every single day has been killed inside an UNRWA shelter. I'll maybe now just say a bit about what we're still able to do in Gaza. I mentioned earlier that distributions have ground to a halt since the supplies became depleted. Now, a lot of what the international humanitarian community does in emergency responses around the world is supply driven. It's food, it's water, it's medicines, it's blankets, tents, clothes, etc. Those types of distributions reliant on supply trains have largely ground to a halt. And that's a large part of what UNRWA does, but UNRWA also provides services. These are kind of government-like services that we provide everywhere that we operate, primarily education, uh, primary and preparatory education for children in grades 1 to 9 or 1 to 10, so from age 5 to 14, primary healthcare, and that covers a range of basic healthcare in terms of vaccination programs for children, antenatal care, postnatal care, child health in terms of growth and height monitoring, as well as diabetes, non-communicable disease care as well for middle-aged and elderly people. Gaza is relatively or was relatively kind of middle class or in the kind of middle level of development in terms of disease, in terms of morbidity before the war. This wasn't an environment where children were dying of infectious diseases. It was rather a place where the health transition had taken place and there was lots of sickness, lots of illness from some of those more sedentary diseases that we see in the West in terms of diabetes, hypertension, obesity, etc. So those are the types of services that we're providing in peace times, and these are the types of services that are able to continue during the war. Our health clinics continue. Our teachers are now running emergency shelters or helping with distributions. We have hundreds of social workers, hundreds of garbage collectors that every day are picking up the garbage. We have hundreds of counselors as well, providing some kind of psychosocial support to mainly to children. And these staff, despite the blockade, are able to continue delivering, and that's about 12,000 per day. So as well as representing a key element of public health and social services inside Gaza, it also represents quite a large part of the humanitarian response. So for each of these workers, they will be supporting 10 or 15 family members, extended family members. So there's a large share of the population that's, as well as through distributions, relies on UNRWA for a salary to help it through the worst of the conflict. And the scale of what UNRWA is able to do with those 12,000 staff is quite extraordinary, given other conflicts and other humanitarian situations around the world, where it's rare that you've got an instrument such as UNRWA, an actor such as UNRWA that was there at such large scale before the conflict, is accepted by the community, enjoys a high level of trust, works across multiple sectors, is able to provide integrated support. We're working in many ways like a government or like a municipality in terms of the types of services that we provide, and you can see here some of the scale of what we do. So every day we've provided 3 million liters of water to the population. So that meets the minimum needs of 200,000 people a day based on minimum requirements of 15 liters of water each day. The reality is that people are surviving on about 6 liters of water a day in Gaza. So the water that we're providing is essentially meeting the needs of, well, is essentially reaching rather than meeting the needs of about 500,000 people. And the garbage, the 200 tons of solid waste that we collect every day, is also meeting the needs of about 500,000 people. So in the area of basic sanitation, basic public health, we're having a massive impact. Working with others, working with the local municipalities that manage a lot of the landfills, working with UNICEF that also does a lot of work in the water sector, and UNDP and others. But these are the services that are continuing despite the blockade and despite the ban that Israel has brought in on UNRWA. Healthcare, I mentioned healthcare a bit already. We as UNRWA represent about 2/3 of the primary healthcare sector inside Gaza. So each day of this last week, we have provided about 15,000, 16,000 medical consultations. That's 6 days a week. We have 1,300 professional medical staff working in health clinics, working in health points that have been set up in the temporary shelters, in the schools. It's UNRWA's health infrastructure played a key part in the various rounds of the polio response earlier in the year and last year, vaccinating about 250,000 children through our staff. We're also the largest provider of nutritional supplies that have been made available by UNICEF and others since the start of the conflict. Now, we've been operating under real constraints in terms of medicines since the start of the war due to access issues, but we were able to bring a lot in during the ceasefire, but those drugs are increasingly out of stock. Last month, we were down to 33% of drugs out of stock, essential drugs. Now we're up to over 40%, and those numbers will keep going up. So we are starting to face key gaps in terms of medical supplies, and as well as food and shelter items, we've got those medical supplies waiting in Jordan to enter. So provided the borders open, we can get those supplies in, and we have the capability to distribute them. When it comes to education, education was UNRWA's largest sector before the war. We were previously educating about 300,000 children in 300 schools with 900 staff. The learning that's been provided is largely ground to a halt since the war. So children are now coming to the end of the second school year in which they've had no real formal education, which of course is catastrophic for them, for their families, and for the longer term prospects of the Gaza Strip. We were able during the ceasefire to make available a number of classrooms in our shelters, functioning as temporary learning spaces to allow children to have some kind of modicum of learning. The children who were registered in October 2023, before the war, were regrouped into their classes with their old teachers, together with new children who'd been displaced and were living in the shelters. And for a few weeks, we were back to educating over 55,000 children. Focus was on the younger ages, on kind of basic literacy, basic numeracy, but also just about meeting their peers, their children of the same age, and learning about the structure of being in a classroom and the discipline that comes with that, and also giving their parents a bit of a break. But that's all now been massively reduced as a result of the bombardments. Many of the schools in which we were providing these services are now in evacuation orders. We're also limited in terms of the supplies that we're able to provide. Kids going to these learning spaces would receive biscuits, they'd receive water, snacks, etc. That were donated from UNICEF and others. Those are now no longer available. So the levels of learning that we're able to provide have been massively diminished. We are operating in parallel distance learning, and many thousands or hundreds of thousands of children have registered, and these children receive every couple of weeks, they receive exercises on mobile phones, keep teaching them the kind of core principles of in core subjects: Arabic, maths, English, and for some science. But of course, given the problems with connectivity and the realities of these repeated displacement orders, it's very difficult for many children to keep up. We were able, before the ceasefire completely broke down, to complete the 2023-2024 school year. So now children have graduated to the next year, as it were, but we recognize and accept that this is far from ideal. And of course, as you saw on some of the slides earlier, the vast majority of school buildings have been damaged or destroyed. So the reconstruction effort, physically in terms of school buildings, etc., following the end of the war, will be massive. It's likely that children will be learning in tents, in temporary structures for a long time after the war, whilst this reconstruction takes place. Protection is a lot of what we do as well. We have almost 100 staff that visit our installations, visit the shelters to assess needs, to try and link people with services, to provide specialized support to more vulnerable cases, whether that be survivors of gender-based violence, children who've been separated from their parents, case management to some of the more traumatized. And we provide some of these services inside UNRWA, or the monitors protection staff will refer the cases to other services inside of UNRWA, for example, health staff, education staff, social workers, etc., or else they'll be referred externally to other organizations that are providing more tailored support. And we've provided psychosocial support and mental health activities to over 500,000 children since the start of the war, and in total over 700,000 people, so about a third of the entire population. So again, a sense of the scale of what UNRWA is able to do because of the extent of our networks, our staff, infrastructure, etc. I can talk on this briefly. You're probably aware, I mentioned it in the beginning, but essentially the IPC is an international body of UN agencies, academics, and other experts that assess food security conditions in humanitarian crises. They were set up about 20, 30 years ago. They've done a series of assessments in Gaza. The last one came out last week and has pointed to a marked deterioration in Gaza, and that's as to be expected following the onset of the blockade. And they're basically saying that the entire population is at risk of famine, and that 500,000 people are already facing starvation. Now, we know from other conflicts and other situations around the world that by the time famine is declared, it's too late. So these findings that are also manifesting themselves in terms of increased rates of malnutrition, which, as you will know better than me, has lifelong impacts on physical and mental development. They're also on the increase. So really worrying findings that came out from this report that was issued about 10 days or so ago. Very quickly on UNRWA's operations, the impact of the Knesset legislation on UNRWA's operations. Now, the Knesset bills were passed at the end of October of last year, and they state two things. They prohibit UNRWA's operations on the sovereign territory of Israel. Now, of course, that doesn't include the Gaza Strip. It doesn't include the West Bank. In the international community's eyes, it doesn't include East Jerusalem either. But many of you may have seen that UNRWA's primary schools in East Jerusalem were raided on the 8th of May, raided by soldiers and police, I believe, ordering a stop to those services. So that has had an impact on the services in Jerusalem, which Israel considers the sovereign territory of Israel, East Jerusalem, rather. But the one element is a ban on our activities in the sovereign territory of Israel, which, as I say, shouldn't impact on our services in Gaza. But the other part of the legislation, which is a no contact policy between UNRWA and Israeli officials, that's where the impact on our operations is. As a result of that no contact policy, it's no longer possible for UNRWA international staff to enter Gaza, because entering Gaza requires crossing an Israeli-controlled border. Israel has also made it clear that they are not willing or able to support the entry of UNRWA supplies into the Gaza Strip as a result of the no contact policy. Now, before the ceasefire broke down, we were able to bring these supplies in under the auspices of other organizations, or by hiding the UNRWA insignia and UNRWA markings on these boxes of aid. Israel has indicated that that may no longer, or will no longer, be possible when the blockade is lifted. But look, the dynamics of the situation have changed so much in the past couple of weeks or so in relation to these new aid modalities that are being spoken about, the establishment of a new entity, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, to manage distributions of aid, the onset of these incredibly intense military operations and the stated intent of Israeli authorities. So it's right now we really don't know where this is going, not just in terms of our ability to bring supplies in, but the entire humanitarian community's ability to bring supplies in remains stuck right now. So we have this real dilemma of a population that's starving, clear obligations on the part of the parties to the conflict, and months and tens of millions of dollars of critical supplies stuck outside. But of course, as I said, the international staff have left, and we are about 20-25 international staff inside of Gaza. The national staff, those 12,000 staff, remain. They continue to provide services. We are facing increased questions from many of our donors about how we're ensuring oversight and guarding against risks and of interference, etc., on our operations due to the absence of international staff. We're putting a lot of measures in place, mechanisms in place to manage those risks and provide those assurances. But it's, as you can imagine, it's tricky given the realities of the situation, and more than that, it's just very, very difficult to manage such a conflict of such intensity from outside. So we're working as well more closely now with other humanitarian organizations inside of Gaza to ensure that they have an understanding of what UNRWA does, of how we work, of how we need to work together to make this about the people, about the UN, about the humanitarian response, rather than about UNRWA specifically. So this is what I talked about earlier. So I think I've covered all of this. There's maybe just one point as well, and it is a particular risk in the current situation when the conflict is so intense. Because of the no contact policy, we're no longer able to liaise directly with Israeli authorities when it comes to staff movements. We have to work through OCHA, through third parties, to coordinate the movement of our staff. Israel is still comfortable with doing those coordinations, but it has to be done through a third party. And what it means is that when there are critical incidents, when we've got staff in life or death situations, or staff desperately trying to evacuate certain areas, which of course happens quite regularly in the current context, we do not have direct line of communication with the Israeli authorities. So it's putting those staff at a greater risk, which all parties accept is not in our interest or in their interest. But right now, it's just a reality that we've got to maneuver. And we're also stuck in terms of this indirect impacts on our operations inside of Gaza. The Israeli High Court has acknowledged and stated that the Knesset laws do not apply inside of Gaza, or indeed inside of the West Bank. But for all practical intents and purposes, if you're blocking the entry of staff, if you're blocking the entry of supplies, then there is a direct impact on our activities inside of Gaza. And at a time when the international community should be using all tools at its disposal to meet the humanitarian crisis inside of Gaza, diminishing the operating ability of the largest actor inside of Gaza works against that, and also works against the ICJ rulings that have been issued over the past 12 months or so, concluding that all efforts need to be done to facilitate aid delivery. So just finally to end, I'm in Brussels this week. I'm in other places whilst I'm operating in exile, really trying to push member states, and we continue to enjoy an awful lot of support amongst many member states, with a few obvious exceptions, but calling on those donors who do continue to politically support UNRWA to use that whatever political leverage that they've got to preserve our ability to continue operating and implementing our mandate, which has been given to us by the General Assembly. We're also calling, and I'm not sure how realistic it is at the current time, but calling for the no contact policy to be lifted, to be reversed, that would allow and enable UNRWA international personnel to return, and it would allow us to continue distributing aid inside of Gaza on top of the services that we're providing. Of course, on top of that, we're calling for an immediate unconditional ceasefire, protection of aid workers, dignified and immediate release of all remaining hostages, and a resumption of aid flows into the Gaza Strip, so that the suffering of the population, if not can come to an end, can be reversed with immediate effect. With that, Alice, I've kind of ended my slides, so happy to pass back to you, and we can do some Q&A if there are any questions.
Sure. So thank you so much for this fairly devastating report. I'm going to take two questions and put them together because they are similar. One, Evan says, what would you say is the biggest misconception of UNRWA in U.S. media, and what is your response to that? How does or doesn't the portrayal of UNRWA in the U.S. differ from what you see in the rest of the world? And the second question is, could you comment on the Hasbara, the propaganda slander about UNRWA by Israel, and what they have said? Has any evidence been offered, and what has been the impact? So I want to combine those two questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the biggest misconceptions about UNRWA well, maybe not just in the US media, but amongst detractors of UNRWA, I guess there are two that come to mind. One is, and then that links to, I guess, in a way to, or helps explain why UNRWA is so under attack. One is that UNRWA perpetuates the refugee issue amongst Palestinians by passing on refugee status from one generation to another. So there were about 750,000 refugees from Mandate Palestine in 1948 when the State of Israel was created. We've now got about 6 million people registered with us. So an argument that's made is that UNRWA uniquely passes on refugee status to subsequent generations, and that's a complete falsehood. UNRWA is a separate regime that deals with Palestinians, whereas UNHCR deals with all the other world's refugees. But UNHCR too, and according to the Refugee Convention, refugee status is passed on from generation to generation in the event that there's no solution to the situation. So UNRWA in this is held up as uniquely amplifying and making much larger the Palestinian refugee issue, as if without UNRWA, if UNRWA wasn't doing this, then the problem wouldn't exist. So UNRWA's very existence is the problem, rather than a lack of a just solution for Palestinians. The other, and kind of linked to that, the other argument is that UNRWA keeps the refugee and the Palestinian issue alive because, and again, legally, it doesn't make any sense, because the Palestinian right of return and the UN resolutions that govern the resolution of the conflict are completely separate to UNRWA. UNRWA's role is to provide services until such a time as is either no longer possible or there is a resolution of the conflict. UNRWA has no political role in the refugee, in resolving the problem or the right of return. But UNRWA is such a powerful symbol and a powerful reminder, both internationally but also domestically within Israel, that it's taken on this this kind of hate factor that's been magnified massively since the 7th of October. And massive, and in part because of allegations that UNRWA staff members participated in the 7th of October attacks. And in terms of the propaganda, I mean, we have been subject to savage, ongoing, attacks since the start of the conflict, misinformation, propaganda that is being broadcast by we're a UN agency. We have a small communications department. On the other side, when you've got a state, it's very difficult to combat that. But there've been a number of instances when falsehoods have been propagated about UNRWA. So for example, after Yahya Sinwar was killed, within 20 minutes of his being killed, a photograph was put out by, I think, the IDF or the MFA, with a picture of a passport of an UNRWA staff member next to him. And the allegation was that this staff member was a bodyguard of Sinwar's, and therefore he'd been killed as well, and therefore UNRWA was Hamas. The fact is that the staff member was in Egypt. He left a year or so earlier. This was an expired passport. There was no proof or evidence given that that passport was found on the scene of the crime, as it were, or that this staff member had been implicated in any way. But the association was made. We've seen other instances when we were doing a polio campaign in the north, and the staff were stopped at the checkpoints, and the IDF put out tweets and social media saying that a UN convoy had been infiltrated by Hamas. None of it was true, but it was put out there. And whilst we were trying to maneuver the safe passage of our staff through the checkpoint and through the issue, they were being actively targeted as Hamas members on social media, which soldiers on the ground follow social media. So they were, the risk is that they're reading the social media that their own forces and leaders have put out, and then that puts our soldiers, our staff at even greater risk. And we receive all sorts of allegations. And of course, we take these allegations incredibly seriously. When allegations were made against UNRWA staff for participation in the October the 7th attacks, the UNRWA Commissioner General put these people on administrative leave immediately without any evidence. We repeatedly ask for evidence to be provided whenever there are cases such as this. We don't have a police force or an intelligence capability. We have to rely on others, and evidence is never forthcoming to help us work together with others in case there are real and genuine threats. So we're really pushed into a corner on many of these things. And I think the final thing I'd say is in relation to the absence of foreign journalists in Gaza. So UN agencies, UNRWA, and others are constantly criticized for presenting an inaccurate picture of the actual situation. We've been saying for weeks that there's no food inside Gaza. Spokespeople from Israeli authorities will say that's a complete lie. Many of us, including myself, have been accused of lying by senior Israeli officials. And we've got nothing to hide. We all say there's a pretty simple solution to this, and it's to let the journalists in. If you don't trust the UN, and we are by definition neutral and impartial, then allow international journalists in, whose job is to tell the truth. But that's not happened, despite a lot of pressure from journalists. It's still not happening. So I think it's fairly unique in terms of a conflict that's had such absence of international press for so long.
So I'm going to ask two more questions and then we'll wrap it up. When you described all of the many things that UNRWA has been able to do in terms of education and healthcare and water and sanitation and all that kind of stuff, it's very clear that they have basically been doing the work that the Israeli government would have been responsible for if it had been functioning as the occupying force. So it basically got Israel off the hook. And now there's this proposal for this new distribution service, and it's very militarized, and it only serves like a third of the population, and you have to be, security checked every time you go for your bag of flour. How is that going to work, and what's going to happen to everybody else, and how does that challenge what UNRWA is doing. Do you have any sense of that?
No, I mean, I think on your first point, yeah, I mean, the obligations of the occupying power are to provide services. I think UNRWA has also taken the pressure off the Palestinian service providers as well, because donors have been much more comfortable with funding UNRWA because donors are more comfortable with having children in a UN school than having children in a school run by the de facto authorities, for example. So UNRWA has taken on the burden not just from the occupying power, but I think historically from Palestinian service providers, including right now Hamas, but I guess before them also the Palestinian Authority to a degree. So it's built up this massive infrastructure on which there's increasing demand because of the capability of other service providers. Now, what's being talked about right now in terms of this new modality appears solely to focus on distributions. It's reducing everything to a 20-kilogram box of food that people can collect and meet their basic needs, which is completely ridiculous because people need healthcare, they need sanitation, they need all these other things to stop, to live the basics of a dignified life. They're not being talked to about as part of this system, which, as I say, purely focuses on supplies. It's not clear yet how this organization will function, how this entity will function, how it will meet the needs of the entire population, how practically, people will make the journey of 30, 40 kilometers to pick up their food or their box or whatever, how it will cater for the most vulnerable, including the elderly, including the many, many tens of thousands of people who have lost limbs, who are in wheelchairs, who are amputees, etc. So it remains massively unclear how this operation would function, and what happens to the kind of tens of thousands of tons of aid that are sat outside to procure volumes of supplies. But that volume at that scale takes months and months. So there's all sorts of things about it right now that still don't make much sense. And given the Knesset ban on UNRWA and the clear position of the US authorities, it's hard to see that UNRWA is a part of this plan. But right now, the entire UN and the almost entire international humanitarian community has rejected it. So we wait to see what comes of it.
Okay, and this is unfortunately the last question now. It's how does the no contact policy impact services in the West Bank? I've always wondered if UNRWA provided detailed information to Israel regarding staff, and they, quote, approved such staff. What responsibility do they have in the allegations of UNRWA staff involvement with Hamas? With their expert surveillance, shouldn't they have picked up on that? So it's a...
Yeah, I mean, look, we share our staff lists with Israel, and we have done twice a year for the past 15 or so years. I can't remember exactly when it started, but I believe as recently as July 2023, before the conflict, staff lists were provided and concerns on the understanding that any concerns would be flagged and that UNRWA could take actions. We never received any concerns until I think it was the 20th, whenever it was the day of the ICJ rulings was when this information was kind of made public about the activities of UNRWA staff, or the alleged activities of UNRWA staff. So we already were doing that, and yeah, like the person said, it's to work with member states that have these capabilities. Like I say, we don't have a security apparatus or intelligence services. We can vet our staff against UN sanctions lists, but any information that Israel or others have, the host authorities as well have about the unsuitability of these staff. It was the construct was that it was in all our interests for those staff members to be looked into. In the West Bank, the West Bank, I guess we have to separate East Jerusalem from, we consider East Jerusalem as part of the West Bank, of course, but in terms of Israel's position, East Jerusalem is part of Israel, has been annexed. So our services inside East Jerusalem, the schools in East Jerusalem are now no longer functioning. We run 6 schools, and we run a technical training center that provides vocational education to children or to young adults. Those are no longer functioning. Our field office compound in East Jerusalem is also no longer functioning. It's been vacated. We continue to provide primary healthcare in the old city. So that has
So
is
is this what
able.
going to provide schools for all these kids, or are they just going to not have any opportunity?
I mean, they that was the proposal, but right now, I mean, these children finished. The schools were closed on the 8th of May, and the school year carries on for several more weeks. I think at least a month. Yeah, at least a month, because the school year ends with the Eid on the 8th and 9th of June, and no provision whatsoever has been made to absorb these children. You don't absorb children into school a month before the end of the school year. I'm not close enough to it to know if provision has been made to absorb these 900 children or so in Israeli schools in East Jerusalem with the next academic year. The Jerusalem municipality typically doesn't have much funding available for education. So right now, I mean, I don't deal with the West Bank, so I don't know, but we're certainly concerned about these children's ability to access
Sure.
education. But otherwise, in the rest of the West Bank, services can continue. The staff are able to maneuver their way through checkpoints. International staff have had to leave because their visas expired. So the international staff all left at the end of January. So I guess we've got lots of services ongoing in the West Bank, but we've also got this catastrophe that we're dealing with in the northern West Bank with attacks and displacement of 40,000 people from 3 refugee camps in the northern West Bank. So not on the scale of Gaza, but a hostilities that kind of fall below the radar in the international media because of the gravity of the situation inside of Gaza. But otherwise, the basic services that we are providing in the West Bank more or less continue, yes.
And if this is one last thing, if the plan, it looks like one of the possible plans would be to displace hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from Gaza to a place like Libya. Would UNRWA follow them and do services in whatever country they ended up in?
No, I mean, we have a mandate to provide services in Gaza, West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Outside of those areas, we don't have a mandate. Now, mandates can always be changed, of course, but globally, UNHCR would have that mandate. So, I mean, let's see. There's no desire on the part of these states to welcome this many people, and there's no desire on the Palestinian side to leave. So, yeah, we just have to see where all of that goes, and it would amount to massive forced displacement on a scale we've not seen for decades. So we hope that it doesn't come to pass.
Well, I just want to thank you for this very, very important sharing of information. And we're going to wrap up now. And I'm just going to ask people to be sure to check out our website, jvphealth.org. If you haven't signed up, sign up and join us, and you will get weekly health and human rights updates and other announcements that we send out. And we do on these updates not only send them out to our email list, but also they're put up on the website and they're put out on our social media. The Health Advisory Council also does other advocacy and writing. And, we at the National Members Meeting for Jewish Voice for Peace, we had a panel that was very well received. 80 people came, and then a talk back afterwards where we had a lot of interest in other work that we could do and new members. So we're growing right now, and we're looking at other things that we can do. Our next webinar is July 13th, and it will be Diana Buttu, who is a very well-known human rights lawyer, Palestinian human rights lawyer. And she's going to be talking about the Gazification of the West Bank. So again, we invite you to become a more active member, to sign up. And also there's a feedback form. It's in the chat. Maybe Rachel could put up the link one more time. Please fill it out so we get your feedback and know how to do a better job. And that's it for now. So thank you so much. Take care.
Well, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.